The blood on her dress had dried hours ago, but Tabitha Kane could still smell it in the desert air as she stumbled through the canyon, her leather boots catching on loose stones that scattered down into the darkness below. She had been running since sunset, and now the moon hung like a silver coin above the jagged rock walls that rose around her on all sides, trapping her in this maze of stone and sand somewhere in the Nevada wilderness. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she knew if she did not find water soon, the desert would claim her just as surely as the men who had murdered her father and burned their wagon would if they caught up to her first. She pressed her hand against the canyon wall to steady herself, feeling the rough sandstone scrape against her palm. The events of the afternoon played through her mind in terrible flashes. The wagon train had been 3 days out from Rawhide, Nevada, heading east towards Salt Lake City, with a dozen families seeking new lives in Utah territory. Her father, Thomas Kane, had been a merchant in San Francisco before the financial panic of 1873 had wiped out his business. He had sold everything they owned to buy passage on the wagon train and enough supplies to start fresh. Tabitha, at 22 years old, had been his only family since her mother died of cholera 5 years earlier. The attack had come without warning. 6 men on horseback, their faces covered with bandanas, had ridden down on the train while it traveled through a narrow pass. Gunfire had erupted, and chaos followed. Tabitha remembered her father shoving her toward the rocks, shouting at her to run and hide. She had scrambled up the steep embankment, her skirts tangling around her legs, and when she looked back, she saw her father standing beside their wagon with his old rifle raised. The shot that killed him had echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. She had hidden among the boulders for hours, watching in horror as the bandits ransacked the wagons and shot anyone who resisted. When darkness finally fell, she had climbed down and found her father lying in the dust, his eyes staring up at nothing. The other families were either dead or had fled in different directions. The wagons were burning. She had taken what little she could carry, a canteen of water, her father's pocket watch, and a small pistol he had taught her to shoot. And then she had run into the wilderness, knowing the bandits might return at dawn to search for survivors. Now she was lost. The canyon had seemed like the safest path, hidden from view, but it twisted and turned in ways that confused her sense of direction. Every shadow looked like a man with a gun. Every sound made her heart race. The water in her canteen had run out an hour ago, and her throat felt like sandpaper. Tabitha forced herself to keep walking. The alternative was to sit down and wait for death, and she was not ready for that. Her father had raised her to be strong, to face whatever life threw at her with courage. She would not dishonor his memory by giving up. The canyon floor rose gradually, and she followed it upward, hoping it might lead to higher ground where she could get her bearings. Her legs ached, and blisters had formed on her heels, but she pushed through the pain. The night air grew colder as the hours passed, and she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Then, just as despair began to settle into her bones, she saw it. A light, small and flickering, like a star that had fallen to earth. It was somewhere ahead of her, maybe a quarter-mile distant, glowing warm and steady against the darkness. Her first instinct was fear. What if it was the bandits? But something about the light seemed peaceful, and she realized she had no choice. She needed help, needed water, needed to find another human being in this vast emptiness. Tabitha moved toward the light, her steps quickening despite her exhaustion. As she drew closer, she could see it was a lantern, hanging from what looked like a wooden post. The canyon widened here, opening into a small box canyon with steep walls on 3 sides. There was a simple cabin built against the far wall, constructed of rough-hewn logs and stone. A corral beside it held several horses, and she could hear them moving restlessly in the darkness. The lantern hung beside the cabin door, casting a warm pool of light across a small porch. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and Tabitha could smell coffee and something cooking. Her stomach clenched with hunger. She approached cautiously, one hand on the pistol tucked into her belt. When she was 20 feet from the cabin, the door opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean build that spoke of years spent working under the desert sun. He wore dark trousers, dusty boots, and a worn cotton shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. A gun belt hung at his hip, the holster tied down against his thigh in the manner of someone who knew how to use it. His hair was dark brown, almost black in the lantern light, and fell to his collar. Even from a distance, Tabitha could see his eyes were alert and assessing, taking in every detail of her appearance. "Easy now," he said, his voice deep and calm. "I am not going to hurt you." Tabitha realized her hand was gripping the pistol, though she had not drawn it. She forced herself to let go, raising both hands slightly to show she meant no harm. "Please," she said, and her voice cracked from thirst. "I need help." The man descended the porch steps in 3 long strides and crossed the distance between them. Up close, she could see his face more clearly. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with strong features and a day's worth of stubble on his jaw. His eyes were a striking pale blue, almost gray, and they studied her with a mixture of concern and wariness. "You are hurt," he said, gesturing to her dress. The bloodstains were visible even in the dim light. "It is not my blood," Tabitha said. "My father. He was killed this afternoon. Bandits attacked our wagon train." Something flickered in the man's eyes, anger perhaps, or recognition. He nodded once, then gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside. You need water and food, and those are questions that can wait until you are on your feet again." He turned and walked back to the cabin, taking the lantern from its post. Tabitha followed, her legs trembling with relief and exhaustion. As they climbed the porch steps, she noticed a name carved into a wooden sign beside the door: Harrison Hart. Inside, the cabin was simple but well maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a fire crackling in the hearth. A wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room, and a narrow bed with a quilted blanket occupied one corner. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies, books, and various tools. Everything was neat and organized, the home of a man who lived alone but took pride in his space. Harrison guided her to one of the chairs and then poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup. "Drink slowly," he said, handing it to her. "You will make yourself sick if you gulp it down." Tabitha took the cup with shaking hands and forced herself to sip, despite her body's desperate demand to drain it in one go. The water was cool and clean, the best thing she had ever tasted. Harrison moved to the fireplace, where a pot of stew was simmering on a hook over the flames. He ladled some into a bowl and brought it to her with a spoon and a thick slice of bread. "Eat," he said simply. She did not need to be told twice. The stew was simple, beans and meat with onions and peppers, but it was hot and filling. She forced herself to eat slowly, aware that her stomach had been empty for too long. Harrison did not hover or ask questions. He moved around the cabin, giving her space while she ate, pouring himself a cup of coffee and standing by the fireplace. When she had finished half the bowl, she set the spoon down and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "I did not think I would find anyone out here." "This canyon is not easy to find," Harrison said. "I have lived here for 3 years, and you were the first person to stumble across it by accident. You must have been wandering for hours." "Since sunset," Tabitha confirmed. "I did not know where I was going. I just needed to get away from the main trail in case the bandits came back." Harrison's expression darkened. "Tell me what happened." Tabitha recounted the events of the afternoon, her voice steady despite the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She described the attack, her father's death, the burning wagons, and her flight into the wilderness. Harrison listened without interrupting, his face growing grimmer with each detail. "6 men, you said?" he asked when she finished. "Yes. They wore bandanas over their faces, but I saw their horses. One was a big roan with a white blaze, and another was a paint with dark spots on its hindquarters." Harrison nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I know those horses. The men you are describing are part of a gang that has been operating in this territory for the past 2 years. They call themselves the Red Rock Boys, after the canyon where they hide their camp. The law has been trying to catch them, but they know this country too well." "You know them?" Tabitha asked, her hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at her belt. "I know of them," Harrison said. "But I am not one of them, if that is what you are worried about. I run cattle in this territory, or I used to before the drought drove most of my herds south. Now I work as a guide and tracker when people need someone who knows the desert. I have helped the territorial marshal track the Red Rock Boys twice, but both times they slipped away before we could catch them." Tabitha studied his face, looking for any sign of deception, but his eyes were steady and honest. She relaxed slightly, realizing that if he had wanted to hurt her, he could have done so already. "I need to get to Rawhide," she said. I need to report what happened, and I need to bury my father properly. Can you help me?" "Rawhide is 2 days' ride from here," Harrison said. "You are in no condition to travel tonight. You will stay here, rest, and at first light, we will head back to where the attack happened. If your father is still there, we will see to his burial. Then I will take you to Rawhide." Tabitha felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed since her father's death. The kindness in Harrison's voice, the simple humanity of his offer, broke through the wall she had built around her emotions. "Why would you do this for me? You do not know me." "Because it is the right thing to do," Harrison said, "and because no one should have to face what you have faced alone." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, nodding. "Thank you. I do not know how I will repay you, but I will find a way." "We can worry about that later," Harrison said. He moved to the bed and pulled a blanket from the trunk at its foot. "You take the bed tonight. I will sleep on the floor by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Tabitha protested. "You can, and you will," Harrison said firmly. "You have been through hell today, and you need real rest. Do not argue with me on this." Tabitha was too exhausted to argue. She stood, her legs wobbling slightly, and made her way to the bed. It was narrow but comfortable, the mattress stuffed with straw and covered with clean sheets. She sat down and pulled off her boots, wincing at the blisters on her heels. Harrison brought her a small basin of water and a cloth. "Clean those blisters before you sleep," he said. "I have some salve that will help." He turned away to give her privacy, and Tabitha washed her feet and applied the salve he left on the small table beside the bed. Then she lay down, fully clothed except for her boots, and pulled the blanket over herself. The bed smelled faintly of sage and leather, masculine and comforting. "Harrison," she said into the darkness. "Yes?" "What were you doing out on the porch tonight? How did you know I was coming?" There was a pause, and then he said, "The horses were restless. They sensed something moving in the canyon. I went out to check, and I saw you stumbling toward the light. If I had not been watching, you might have walked right past without seeing the cabin." "Then I am doubly grateful," Tabitha said. "Your lantern saved my life." "Get some sleep," Harrison said gently. "Tomorrow will be a hard day." Tabitha closed her eyes, and despite everything that had happened, despite the grief and fear that churned in her chest, she fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the knowledge that, for the moment at least, she was safe. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's small window, painting the room in shades of gold. Tabitha sat up, disoriented for a moment, and then the events of the previous day came rushing back. Her father was dead. The wagon train had been destroyed. She was in the home of a stranger who had offered to help her. Harrison stood at the fireplace, tending a skillet over the flames. He had washed and shaved, and his hair was tied back with a leather cord. He wore the same clothes as the night before, but he had added a vest and a wide-brimmed hat that hung on a peg beside the door. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "There is fresh water in the pitcher if you want to wash up." Tabitha stood and stretched, feeling the stiffness in her muscles. She poured water into the basin and washed her face and hands, grateful for the chance to clean away some of the dust and grime from the previous day. When she finished, Harrison handed her a plate with bacon, fried eggs, and a thick slice of bread. "Eat up," he said. "We have a long ride ahead of us." They ate in companionable silence, and then Harrison gathered supplies for the journey. He packed saddlebags with food, water, ammunition, and a shovel, his movements efficient and practiced. Tabitha watched him, noting the way he checked each item carefully, the way his hands moved with confidence and purpose. There was something reassuring about his competence, the sense that he knew exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. When he was ready, Harrison led her outside to the corral. 3 horses stood waiting, already saddled. One was a tall bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. Another was a smaller chestnut mare with a white star on her forehead. The third was a sturdy pack horse, a dun with a thick neck and powerful legs. "You will ride the mare," Harrison said. "Her name is Cinnamon, and she has a gentle mouth. She will take care of you." Tabitha approached the mare and stroked her neck. The horse whickered softly, pressing her nose against Tabitha's shoulder. "She is beautiful," Tabitha said. "She belonged to my sister," Harrison said. And there was something in his voice that made Tabitha glance at him sharply. "Belonged?" she asked carefully. "She died 2 years ago," Harrison said, his voice flat. Fever. There was nothing the doctor could do. I am sorry, Tabitha said, and she meant it. She understood loss, understood the way it carved pieces out of your heart and left you hollow. Harrison nodded once, accepting her condolence, and then helped her mount. Tabitha settled into the saddle, adjusting her skirts and gripping the reins. It had been years since she had ridden, but the skills came back to her quickly. Harrison swung onto the bay with easy grace, and they set out from the box canyon, the pack horse following on a lead rope. The journey back to the site of the attack took most of the morning. Harrison led them through the maze of canyons with sure knowledge, never hesitating at the countless forks and turns. He rode in silence, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape for danger. Tabitha followed, her heart growing heavier with each passing mile as they drew closer to the place where her father had died. They reached the main trail just after noon. The burned wagons were still there, blackened skeletons against the desert sand. Vultures circled overhead, dark shapes against the brilliant blue sky. Tabitha felt bile rise in her throat, and she had to force herself to breathe steadily as they rode closer. Harrison dismounted first and walked among the wreckage, his hand resting on his pistol. The bodies had been disturbed by scavengers, and Tabitha looked away, unable to bear the sight. Harrison moved with grim efficiency, checking each body. There are 8 here, he said. 7 men and 1 woman. Is your father among them? Tabitha forced herself to look, though it took every ounce of courage she possessed. She recognized the bodies despite the damage, people she had known for only a few days but who had been kind to her. The Johnsons, the elderly couple from Sacramento, the Miller family with their 3 young sons, and there, beside the wreckage of their wagon, was her father. That is him, she whispered, pointing. Harrison walked to the body and knelt beside it. After a moment, he stood and came back to Tabitha. I will bury him properly, he said. You do not need to watch if you do not want to. I want to help, Tabitha said, dismounting. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand straight. He was my father. I need to do this for him. Harrison studied her face for a long moment, and then he nodded. All right, we will do it together. They found a spot under a Joshua tree about 50 yards from the trail, a place with a view of the distant mountains. Harrison dug while Tabitha gathered stones to mark the grave. It was hard, brutal work under the merciless sun, but Tabitha welcomed the physical exertion. It gave her something to focus on, besides her grief. When the grave was ready, Harrison wrapped her father's body in a blanket from the pack horse and carried him to the hole. They lowered him in carefully, and then Tabitha said a prayer, her voice breaking on the words. Harrison stood beside her, his hat in his hands, his head bowed respectfully. They filled in the grave and piled the stones on top, marking it so she would be able to find it again if she ever returned. When they finished, Tabitha placed her father's pocket watch on top of the stones, the gold gleaming in the sunlight. He gave this to me when we left San Francisco, she said. He said it was to remember him by, to remember that time was precious and we should not waste it. But I think he would want it here with him. He would be proud of you, Harrison said quietly, for surviving, for being strong. Tabitha nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They stood in silence for several minutes, and then Harrison said, We should bury the others too. It is not right to leave them for the scavengers. They spent the rest of the afternoon digging graves. It was exhausting work, and by the time they finished, the sun was sinking toward the western horizon. They had buried all 8 bodies under the same Joshua tree, marking each grave with stones. Harrison carved names into flat pieces of wood where Tabitha could remember them. Simple markers that would last a few years before the desert reclaimed them. As they mounted their horses to leave, Tabitha took one last look at the graves. Thank you, she said to Harrison, for helping me do this, for treating them with dignity. It was the least we could do, Harrison said. He pointed toward the setting sun. We will not make it back to my cabin before dark. There is a water hole about 5 miles west, a good place to camp for the night. We will head there. They rode in silence as the sun painted the desert in shades of red and gold. Tabitha felt numb, her emotions too raw and tangled to sort through. She kept replaying her final moments with her father, wishing she had said something more meaningful, something that would have let him know how much she loved him. The water hole was a small spring that bubbled up from the rocks and collected in a natural basin before disappearing back into the sand. Cottonwood trees grew around it, providing shade and shelter. Harrison set up camp with practiced efficiency, unsaddling the horses and letting them drink before picketing them where they could graze on the sparse grass. He built a fire and boiled coffee while Tabitha sat on a rock, staring into the flames. "You should eat," Harrison said, handing her a plate of beans and dried beef. "I am not hungry," Tabitha said. "Eat anyway," Harrison said firmly. "You need to keep your strength up." Tabitha took the plate and forced herself to eat, though the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Harrison ate in silence, giving her space to grieve. When they finished, he took the plates to the spring to wash them, and Tabitha stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, looking up at the stars. The night sky was spectacular, a river of light stretching from horizon to horizon. She had never seen so many stars in San Francisco, where the city lights washed them out. Here in the desert, they blazed with fierce intensity, ancient and unchanging. "Beautiful, is it not?" Harrison said, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," Tabitha said. "My father loved the stars. He used to tell me stories about the constellations when I was a child. I had forgotten that until now." "What was he like?" Harrison asked. "Your father?" Tabitha smiled despite her sadness. "He was kind, patient. He always saw the best in people, even when they did not deserve it. After my mother died, he raised me alone, and he never complained, never made me feel like I was a burden. He taught me to read and write, to do arithmetic, to think for myself. He said a woman needed to be able to stand on her own in this world because you never knew when circumstances might change." "He sounds like a good man," Harrison said. "He was," Tabitha said, "the best I have ever known." They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars, and then Harrison said, "My sister was like that too. She saw beauty in everything, even in this harsh desert. She could find a flower growing in a crack in the rocks and spend an hour just looking at it, marveling at how something so delicate could survive in such a hostile place." "What was her name?" Tabitha asked. "Helen," Harrison said. "Helen Hart. She was 2 years younger than me, and she followed me out here when I decided to try ranching. Said she wanted an adventure, wanted to see the world beyond Boston where we grew up. I tried to talk her out of it, told her the desert was no place for a lady, but she was stubborn. She came anyway." "You must miss her terribly," Tabitha said. "Every day," Harrison admitted. "Sometimes I wake up and forget she is gone, and I start to call for her before I remember. The cabin feels empty without her." Tabitha reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a simple gesture of comfort. Harrison looked down at her hand, and then at her face, and something passed between them in that moment, an understanding born of shared grief. "We should get some rest," Harrison said, his voice rough. "Tomorrow we ride for Rawhide." He turned and walked back to the fire, and Tabitha followed. Harrison had spread out 2 bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, giving them each privacy. Tabitha lay down on hers, wrapping herself in the blanket he had provided. The ground was hard, and the night air was cold, but she was too tired to care. "Harrison," she said into the darkness. "Yes? I am glad I found your cabin. I do not know what I would have done if your lantern had not been there." "The desert has a way of bringing people together when they need each other most," Harrison said. "Get some sleep, Tabitha." She closed her eyes and listened to the crackle of the fire, the soft sounds of the horses moving in the darkness, and the steady rhythm of Harrison's breathing. Despite everything, she felt safe, protected by this man who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. The next morning, they broke camp at dawn and rode hard for Rawhide. The town was a rough collection of buildings clustered around a main street, with a saloon, a general store, a hotel, and a marshal's office. Wooden sidewalks lined the dusty street, and hitching posts stood at regular intervals. People moved about their business, paying little attention to the 2 riders who cantered into town. Harrison led them directly to the marshal's office, a squat adobe building with barred windows. He dismounted and helped Tabitha down, and then they went inside. The marshal was a grizzled man in his 50s with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent in the sun. His name was Marshal Tom Garrett, and he listened with growing anger as Tabitha recounted the attack on the wagon train. "The Red Rock Boys," he said when she finished, spitting into a brass spittoon in the corner. "I have been trying to catch those bastards for 2 years. Pardon my language, Miss Kane, but they are a plague on this territory." "Can you catch them?" Tabitha asked. "Can you bring them to justice?" "I can try," Marshall Garrett said. "But they know this desert like the back of their hand, and they have friends in places I cannot touch. Still, what they did to that wagon train is murder, plain and simple. I will put together a posse and ride out to Red Rock Canyon, see if we can flush them out." "I will ride with you," Harrison said. Marshall Garrett looked at him appraisingly. "I could use someone with your skills, Harrison. You know the desert as well as they do." "When do we leave?" Harrison asked. "Tomorrow at dawn," the marshal said. "I need time to gather men who can ride and shoot." Tabitha felt a surge of fear at the thought of Harrison riding into danger. "Is that necessary?" she asked. "Can you not let the marshal and his men handle it?" Harrison looked at her, his pale blue eyes serious. "Those men killed your father, Tabitha. They killed innocent people. If I can help bring them to justice, I have to do it." Tabitha wanted to argue, wanted to tell him it was not his fight, but she could see the determination in his face. She nodded reluctantly. "Please, be careful." "I will," Harrison promised. Marshall Garrett stood and walked to a large map on the wall, pointing to an area marked with red ink. "Red Rock Canyon is here, about 30 miles northeast of town. It is rough country, with plenty of places to hide. If they are holed up there, it will not be easy to root them out." "We will find a way," Harrison said. The marshal nodded and then turned to Tabitha. "Miss Kane, I am very sorry for your loss. If there is anything I can do for you, you just let me know." "Thank you, Marshal," Tabitha said. "I need to find a place to stay while I figure out what to do next. My father and I were heading to Salt Lake City, but now I do not know if I should continue or go back to San Francisco." "The hotel is just down the street," Marshall Garrett said. "Mrs. Cooper runs it, and she is a kind woman. Tell her I sent you, and she will take good care of you." Harrison walked with Tabitha to the hotel, leading the horses. The building was 2 stories tall, with a covered porch and rocking chairs lined up along the front. A sign above the door read, "Cooper's Hotel and Boarding House." Inside, a plump woman with gray hair and a warm smile greeted them from behind a desk. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" "Marshall Garrett sent us," Harrison said. "Miss Kane needs a room." "Mrs. Cooper's smile faded as she looked at Tabitha's worn and blood-stained dress. "Oh, you poor dear. Come in, come in. I have a nice room on the 2nd floor with a view of the mountains. It is quiet and clean, and I will have hot water sent up so you can have a bath." "Thank you," Tabitha said. "How much do I owe you?" "We can settle that later," Mrs. Cooper said kindly. "Right now, you look like you need rest and care more than you need to worry about money." Harrison paid for a week's stay before Tabitha could protest, handing Mrs. Cooper silver coins from a leather pouch. "Send the bill to me if she needs anything else," he said. "Harrison, you do not need to do that," Tabitha said. "You have already done so much." "Consider it payment for your company on the ride," Harrison said with a slight smile. "I will come check on you after the posse returns from Red Rock Canyon." "How long will you be gone?" Tabitha asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "A few days at most," Harrison said. "Maybe a week if we have trouble finding them." Tabitha wanted to ask him not to go, to stay here in town where it was safe, but she knew she had no right. He was not hers to command, and she barely knew him. Still, the thought of him riding into danger made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not quite name. "Promise me you will come back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harrison looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I promise," he said. "I will come back." Then he turned and walked out of the hotel, and Tabitha watched him go, feeling more alone than she had since her father's death. Mrs. Cooper led her upstairs to a small but comfortable room with a brass bed, a wardrobe, and a washstand. True to her word, the woman had hot water brought up, and Tabitha gratefully washed away the dust and grime of the past 2 days. Mrs. Cooper also provided her with a clean dress, a simple blue calico that had belonged to her daughter. "She moved to Denver last year," Mrs. Cooper explained. "Got married to a banker, left a trunk full of clothes behind, said I could give them to anyone who needed them." "You are very kind," Tabitha said, touched by the generosity. "We women have to look out for each other in this territory," Mrs. Cooper said. "Now, you rest. I will have supper sent up later." Tabitha lay down on the bed after Mrs. Cooper left, intending to rest for just a few minutes. Instead, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep and did not wake until the following morning. The next few days passed in a strange haze. Tabitha stayed at the hotel, venturing out only to walk around the town or sit on the porch in one of the rocking chairs. Mrs. Cooper was a constant source of comfort, bringing her meals and sitting with her in the evenings, sharing stories of her own life and asking nothing in return. But Tabitha's thoughts kept returning to Harrison. She wondered where he was, whether he and the posse had found the Red Rock Boys, whether he was safe. The fear that something might happen to him grew stronger each day, and she found herself standing on the hotel porch at sunset, scanning the road that led out of town, hoping to see riders returning. On the 5th day, her vigil was rewarded. A group of horsemen appeared on the horizon, riding slowly toward town. Tabitha counted 7 riders, and her heart leaped when she recognized the bay-gelding Harrison rode. He was in the middle of the group, sitting tall in the saddle, apparently unharmed. She ran down the steps and into the street, not caring who saw her or what they thought. Harrison saw her coming and dismounted, catching her as she threw herself at him. His arms came around her, strong and solid, and she buried her face against his chest, breathing in the smell of horse and leather and dust. "You are back," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "You are safe." "I told you I would come back," Harrison said, his voice warm with something that might have been affection. Tabitha pulled back, suddenly aware that they were standing in the middle of the street with half the town watching. She felt her cheeks flush, but Harrison did not seem embarrassed. He smiled at her, a real smile that reached his eyes, and she felt her heart skip a beat. "Did you find them?" she asked. "The Red Rock Boys?" Harrison's smile faded. "We did. They were holed up in the canyon like we thought. There was a fight. 3 of them are dead, and we captured the other 3. They are in the marshal's custody now, waiting for the circuit judge to come through." "It is over then," Tabitha said. "It is over," Harrison confirmed. "They will hang for what they did." Marshal Garrett rode up, dismounting with a groan. "Getting too old for this," he muttered. "Harrison, you fought like a demon out there. I owe you a drink." "Later," Harrison said. "Right now, I need to get these horses taken care of, and I need to talk to Miss Kane." The marshal nodded and walked toward his office. The rest of the posse dispersed, heading to the saloon or their homes. Harrison led his horse and the pack horse toward the livery stable, and Tabitha walked beside him. "How are you holding up?" he asked as they walked. "I am managing," Tabitha said. "Mrs. Cooper has been very kind, but I have been worried about you." "You were worried about me?" Harrison asked, glancing at her with surprise. "Of course I was," Tabitha said. "You rode into danger because of what happened to my father. If you had been killed, I would never have forgiven myself." Harrison stopped walking and turned to face her. "Tabitha, I did not ride with that posse because of you. I mean, I did, but not just because of you. I rode because it was the right thing to do. Those men were killers, and they needed to be stopped before they hurt anyone else." "I know," Tabitha said, "but I still worried." Harrison reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering for a moment against her cheek. "I am glad someone was worried about me," he said softly. "It has been a long time since anyone cared whether I came back or not." Tabitha felt her breath catch at the intensity in his eyes. There was something happening between them, something that had been building since the night she stumbled into his camp. It was more than gratitude, more than simple attraction. It was a connection, fragile but real, forged in shared grief and danger. "Will you have supper with me tonight?" Harrison asked. "There is a restaurant in town. Nothing fancy, but the food is good." "I would like that," Tabitha said, her heart racing. "Good," Harrison said. "I will come by the hotel at 6. He turned and led the horses into the livery, and Tabitha walked back to the hotel, feeling lighter than she had in days. Mrs. Cooper was waiting on the porch, a knowing smile on her face. "That is a good man," she said as Tabitha climbed the steps. "He is," Tabitha agreed. "And if I am not mistaken, he is quite taken with you," Mrs. Cooper said. Tabitha felt her cheeks heat. "We barely know each other." "Sometimes the heart knows what the mind has not figured out yet," Mrs. Cooper said wisely. "I knew I would marry my husband the first day I met him. We were married for 37 years before he passed, and I never regretted a single day." Tabitha went upstairs to her room and looked through the clothes Mrs. Cooper had given her, trying to find something appropriate for supper. She settled on a simple green dress with a white collar and spent more time than necessary fixing her hair, pinning it up and then taking it down again, trying to make it look nice without seeming like she was trying too hard. At exactly 6 o'clock, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find Harrison standing in the hallway, cleaned up and wearing a fresh shirt and a black vest. His hair was still damp from washing, and he had shaved again. He looked handsome in a rugged, unpolished way that made Tabitha's pulse quicken. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes sweeping over her. "Thank you," Tabitha said. "You look very nice yourself." They walked together to the restaurant, a small establishment run by a Chinese family. The food was a mixture of American and Chinese dishes, and Harrison ordered for both of them, choosing dishes he said were particularly good. They ate and talked, the conversation flowing easily between them. Tabitha told him about her life in San Francisco, about growing up in a city that seemed to change overnight, about her mother's death and her father's struggle to keep his business afloat. Harrison told her about Boston, about leaving the city with his sister to try ranching in Nevada, about the hard lessons the desert had taught him. "Do you ever think about going back?" Tabitha asked. "To Boston, I mean." "Sometimes," Harrison admitted. "But there is nothing left for me there. My parents died when I was young, and Helen was my only family. The desert is my home now, for better or worse." "It is a beautiful place," Tabitha said. "Harsh, but beautiful. I can see why you stay." "What about you?" Harrison asked. "What will you do now? Will you go back to San Francisco?" Tabitha had been thinking about that question for days, and she still did not have a clear answer. "I do not know," she said. "There is nothing for me in San Francisco anymore. My father sold everything before we left. But I do not know if I should continue to Salt Lake City either. I would be alone there, starting over in a place where I know no one." "You could stay here," Harrison said, his voice casual but his eyes intense. "In Rawhide. There are opportunities for someone willing to work hard. Mrs. Cooper might need help at the hotel. Or you could find work at the general store." "Are you asking me to stay because you think I need work, or because you want me to stay?" Tabitha asked, her heart pounding. Harrison reached across the table and took her hand. "I want you to stay," he said honestly. "I know we have only known each other a few days, and I know you are still grieving your father, but I have not felt this way about anyone since before Helen died. You make me want to live again, not just survive." Tabitha felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "I do not understand it. I should be too lost in grief to think about anything else. But when I am with you, I feel like I can breathe again. Like there is a reason to keep going." "Then stay," Harrison said, squeezing her hand. "Give us a chance to see what this could become." Tabitha looked into his pale blue eyes and saw hope there, and vulnerability, and something that might have been love beginning to bloom. She thought about her father, about what he would have wanted for her. He had always told her to be brave, to take chances, to live fully. And she thought he would have liked Harrison, would have approved of his honesty and his strength. "All right," she said. "I will stay, at least for a while." The smile that spread across Harrison's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He stood and came around the table, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other while the other diners politely pretended not to notice. That night, as Harrison walked her back to the hotel, Tabitha felt a sense of peace settle over her. She was still grieving, still processing the trauma of the past week, but she was not alone. She had found someone who understood her pain, who shared his own with her, and who was willing to build something new from the ashes of their losses. Over the following weeks, Tabitha settled into life in Rawhide. She took a job helping Mrs. Cooper at the hotel, cleaning rooms and serving meals to the guests. It was hard work, but honest, and it gave her something to focus on besides her grief. Harrison visited every day, riding in from his cabin to have lunch or supper with her, and slowly their relationship deepened. They took long walks together in the evenings, exploring the town and the surrounding desert. Harrison taught her about the plants and animals that lived there, showing her how to find water in unexpected places, how to read the signs of an approaching storm, how to move through the landscape without leaving obvious tracks. Tabitha soaked up the knowledge, fascinated by the complexity of the desert ecosystem. They also talked for hours, sharing their dreams and fears, their memories and hopes. Tabitha told Harrison about her mother, about the pain of watching her die slowly from cholera, about the emptiness that had followed. Harrison told her about the guilt he carried over Helen's death, how he blamed himself for bringing her to the desert, for not recognizing the signs of her illness sooner. "It was not your fault," Tabitha said one evening, as they sat on the porch of the hotel, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "Helen made her own choice to come here. She was an adult, responsible for her own decisions." "I know that in my head," Harrison said, "but my heart has a harder time accepting it. I keep thinking about all the things I could have done differently, all the ways I might have saved her." "I understand," Tabitha said. "I feel the same way about my father. If I had not let him convince me to go on that wagon train, if I had insisted we stay in San Francisco, he would still be alive. Or you both might have starved when the money ran out," Harrison said gently. "You cannot know what would have happened. All you can do is honor their memory by living the life they would have wanted for you." Tabitha leaned her head on his shoulder, and Harrison wrapped his arm around her. They sat like that as the stars began to appear, content in each other's presence. 2 months after Tabitha arrived in Rawhide, the circuit judge came through town, and the 3 surviving members of the Red Rock Boys were tried for murder and robbery. Tabitha attended the trial, sitting in the front row with Harrison beside her. She testified about what she had seen, describing the attack in detail. The trial lasted 3 days, and at the end, the judge found all 3 men guilty. They were sentenced to hang. The execution took place on a cold morning in November. Tabitha did not attend, but Harrison did, standing with Marshall Garrett and the other men who had been on the posse. Afterward, he came to the hotel and found Tabitha in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Cooper prepare lunch. "It is done," he said simply. Tabitha nodded, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but it did not bring her father back. Nothing would ever do that. That evening, Harrison took her out to his cabin for the first time since the night she had stumbled into his camp. The ride through the canyons was just as confusing as she remembered, but this time, she had Harrison beside her, guiding her through the maze of rock and sand. The cabin looked different in daylight. She could see the care Harrison had put into it, the way he had built it to withstand the harsh desert climate, with thick walls and a roof designed to shed heat. The corral was well maintained, and a small garden grew beside the cabin, irrigated by a system of ditches that brought water from a spring higher up in the canyon. Inside, Harrison had made changes. He had added a second chair to the table, and there were curtains on the window, simple but cheerful. A bouquet of desert wildflowers sat in a jar on the table. "You have been preparing for a guest," Tabitha said with a smile. "I was hoping you might visit," Harrison admitted. "I wanted the place to look nice." They spent the afternoon together, talking and laughing. Harrison showed her around his property, pointing out the places where he grazed his remaining cattle, the hidden springs that provided water year-round, the trails that led to other parts of the desert. Tabitha could see why he loved this place, despite its harshness. There was a beauty in its simplicity, a freedom in its vastness. As the sun began to set, Harrison built a fire in the hearth and made coffee. They sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out, and Harrison said, "I have been thinking about the future, about what I want my life to look like." "What do you want?" Tabitha asked. "I want to build something lasting," Harrison said. "I want to expand the ranch, bring in more cattle, maybe even start raising horses. But more than that, I want to share my life with someone. I do not want to be alone anymore." He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "Tabitha, I know it has only been 2 months since we met. I know you are still grieving your father, and I know this is fast, but I love you. I have loved you since the night I saw you walking toward my lantern, lost and afraid, but still fighting. You are the strongest, bravest person I have ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tabitha felt tears stream down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Harrison pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss that left them both breathless. When they finally pulled apart, Tabitha was laughing and crying at the same time. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have loved you since that first night, when you gave me water and food and asked nothing in return. You saved my life, Harrison, in more ways than one." They were married a month later, in a simple ceremony at the church in Rawhide. Mrs. Cooper stood as Tabitha's witness, and Marshall Garrett stood for Harrison. The whole town turned out for the wedding, and afterward, there was a celebration at the hotel with music and dancing and food. Tabitha moved into the cabin with Harrison, and they began building their life together. It was not easy. The desert was unforgiving, and there were many challenges. Droughts came and went, cattle died, and there were times when money was tight, but they faced everything together, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating the good ones. In the spring of 1875, Tabitha discovered she was pregnant. Harrison was overjoyed, building a cradle from oak wood and sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Tabitha spent her days preparing for the baby, sewing clothes and blankets, and reading every book about childbirth she could find. Their son was born on a hot day in August, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Thomas, after Tabitha's father, and he was the light of their lives. Harrison was a devoted father, carrying little Thomas everywhere, teaching him about the desert even when he was too young to understand. 2 years later, a daughter was born, a tiny girl with copper curls and a fierce temper. They named her Helen, after Harrison's sister, and she lived up to her namesake's spirit, fearless and curious about everything. As the years passed, the ranch prospered. Harrison and Tabitha worked side by side, building a herd of cattle and a reputation for quality horses. They expanded the cabin, adding rooms for the children, and eventually building a separate barn and bunkhouse for the ranch hands they hired. Tabitha never forgot her father or the tragic way she had lost him. She visited his grave every year on the anniversary of his death, bringing flowers and telling him about her life, about his grandchildren, about all the things she wished he could have seen. Harrison always went with her, standing quietly beside her as she grieved. But grief did not define her. She had built a new life from the ashes of tragedy, a life filled with love and purpose. She and Harrison were partners in every sense of the word, facing the challenges of the desert and the joys of family together. In 1885, 10 years after their wedding, they hosted a celebration at the ranch. Thomas was 9 years old, tall and serious like his father. Helen was 7, wild and free like the desert wind. Friends and neighbors came from miles around to celebrate the anniversary, and the ranch was filled with laughter and music. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Harrison and Tabitha sat on the porch of their home, looking out at the desert they both loved. The moon was full, casting silver light across the landscape, and the air was cool and sweet. "Do you ever regret staying here?" Harrison asked. "You could have gone back to San Francisco, started over somewhere easier." "Never," Tabitha said firmly. "This is my home. You are my home. Everything I have, everything I am, is because I wandered lost through that canyon and found your light." Harrison pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "That lantern saved both of us," he said. "I was lost too, before you came. Lost in grief and loneliness. You brought me back to life." They sat in comfortable silence, content in each other's presence. Tabitha thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the pain and loss she had endured, but also about the love and joy she had found. Life had taken everything from her that terrible day in the desert, but it had also given her everything she needed to heal and grow. As the years continued to pass, the ranch became one of the most successful in Nevada territory. Thomas grew into a strong young man who shared his father's skill with horses and his mother's head for business. Helen married a rancher from a neighboring property, a good man who loved her fierceness and matched her spirit. Harrison and Tabitha grew old together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing down, but their love never dimmed. They had weathered storms literal and figurative, had buried friends and celebrated births, had built something lasting in this harsh but beautiful land. On a warm evening in the spring of 1902, Tabitha sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset. She was 70 years old now, her hands gnarled with arthritis but still strong. Harrison sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, and they watched their grandchildren play in the yard. Thomas had given them 3 grandsons, and Helen had 2 daughters who were as wild and free as their mother had been. "We have had a good life," Harrison said, his voice still strong despite his 75 years. "The best life," Tabitha agreed. "I would not change a single moment, not even the painful ones. They all led me here, to you, to this family we have built." Harrison kissed her, a gentle kiss that spoke of decades of love and partnership. "I love you, Tabitha Hart. I have loved you from the moment you walked toward my lantern, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Tabitha said, "my cowboy with the lantern who led me home." They sat together as the stars began to appear. just as they had done countless times over the past 27 years. The desert spread out before them, vast and eternal, but they were not afraid of it. They had conquered it together, had made it their own, had raised a family in its midst. The night Harrison had hung that lantern outside his cabin, he had not known he was lighting a beacon that would change both their lives. He had simply been checking on restless horses, going through the motions of survival, but fate had other plans, bringing a lost woman stumbling through the darkness toward his light. And from that chance meeting, from that moment of grace in the midst of tragedy, had grown a love story that would last a lifetime. They had found each other when both were broken, had healed together, and had built something beautiful from the fragments of their shattered lives. As Tabitha sat on the porch with Harrison's arm around her, surrounded by the family they had created, she sent up a silent prayer of thanks. Thanks for the lantern that had saved her life. Thanks for the cowboy who had held her when she needed it most. Thanks for the second chance at happiness she had found in this unlikely place. The desert night settled around them, peaceful and perfect, and Tabitha knew that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. Two souls who had found each other in the darkness, guided by nothing more than a simple lantern and the courage to hope for something better. Their story had begun with loss and fear, but it had blossomed into love and joy, proving that even in the harshest landscapes, beauty could grow. Even in the darkest nights, a single light could lead you home. And even when all seemed lost, fate might have one more surprise in store, one final gift that would change everything. Tabitha had wandered lost through the canyon that night so many years ago, desperate and afraid, not knowing if she would survive until morning. But Harrison's lantern had been there, steady and bright, leading her not just to safety, but to a love that would sustain her for the rest of her life. His arms had caught her when she fell, his heart had healed her when she was broken, and his love had given her a reason to live again. And as they sat together under the stars, two old souls who had weathered every storm and celebrated every joy, they knew that their story was complete. It had all the elements of a grand adventure, the pain and the triumph, the loss and the finding, the darkness and the light. But most of all, it had love, the kind of love that endures all things, hopes all things, believes all things. The kind of love that begins with a lantern in the darkness and two people brave enough to reach for each other across the void. The kind of love that builds empires from dust and creates families from loneliness. The kind of love that proves, once and for all, that even in the wild and unforgiving West, miracles can happen when two hearts find each other against all odds. Thomas and Helen eventually took over the running of the ranch, allowing Harrison and Tabitha to enjoy their golden years in peace. They spent their days sitting on the porch, telling stories to their grandchildren about the old days, about how the West had been when they were young. They spoke of wagon trains and outlaws, of vast empty spaces, and the courage it took to carve out a life in such a harsh land. But mostly they told the story of how they met, of the night Tabitha wandered lost through the canyon and found Harrison's lantern burning bright in the darkness. The grandchildren never tired of hearing it, and each time Tabitha told the tale, she saw it fresh through their wide eyes, remembered the fear and desperation of that night, but also the hope that had flickered to life when she saw that distant light. Harrison would always add his perspective, talking about the restless horses that had drawn him outside, about the instinct that had made him hang the lantern on the post instead of just checking the corral and going back inside. Sometimes, he would say, his blue eyes twinkling, we are guided by forces we do not understand. Sometimes the smallest decision can change the course of our entire life. In the winter of 1903, Harrison fell ill with pneumonia. Tabitha nursed him with fierce devotion, sitting by his bedside day and night, refusing to leave even when Thomas and Helen begged her to rest. She held his hand and told him stories, reminded him of all the years they had shared, all the moments both big and small that had made up their life together. Harrison fought hard, drawing on the same stubborn strength that had allowed him to survive in the desert for so many years. And he won that battle, recovering slowly but surely as winter turned to spring. When he was well enough to sit up and take solid food again, he looked at Tabitha with tears in his eyes. "You saved me," he said, "just like I saved you that night in the canyon." "We saved each other," Tabitha corrected gently. "We have always saved each other." The years continued to roll by, bringing changes large and small. The old century gave way to the new, and the West that Harrison and Tabitha had known in their youth began to fade, replaced by railroads and telegraph lines, by towns growing into cities, and wilderness giving way to civilization. Nevada achieved statehood, and the rough frontier justice of the territorial days was replaced by courts and laws. But some things remained constant. The desert still stretched vast and beautiful, the stars still blazed overhead at night, and the love between Harrison and Tabitha still burned as bright as the lantern that had brought them together. In 1908, they celebrated their 33rd wedding anniversary with a gathering of family and friends at the ranch. Their home was filled with laughter and joy as 3 generations came together to honor the couple who had built this legacy from nothing. Thomas was 42 now, with children of his own who were nearly grown. Helen was 40, still as fierce and vibrant as ever, her daughters blossoming into young women. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Harrison and Tabitha took one last walk together under the stars. They moved slowly now, their bodies bent with age, but they still held hands like young lovers. They walked to the spot where Harrison had first hung the lantern all those years ago, and he pointed to the post, still standing though, weathered by time. "That is where it all began," he said. "That is where I hung the light that led you to me." "No," Tabitha said, squeezing his hand. "That is where you gave me a future. That is where you gave me hope when I had none left." They stood together in the starlight, 2 old souls whose love had weathered every storm. And they knew they had been blessed beyond measure, not because their life had been easy, it had not been, but because they had faced every challenge together, hand in hand, heart to heart. Harrison died peacefully in his sleep on a cool autumn night in 1910 at the age of 83. Tabitha woke to find him lying beside her, a slight smile on his face, as if he had been dreaming of something beautiful. She held him close and wept, but even in her grief, she felt grateful. Grateful for the 35 years they had shared as husband and wife, grateful for the family they had built, grateful for every moment they had been given together. They buried Harrison on a hill overlooking the ranch, in a spot where he could see the desert he had loved and the home he had built. The whole community turned out for the funeral, testament to the respect and affection Harrison had earned over his long life. Thomas gave the eulogy, speaking of his father's strength and integrity, his kindness and his wisdom. Helen wept openly, clinging to her mother's hand. Tabitha stood dry-eyed through the ceremony, her grief too deep for tears. But that night, alone in the cabin they had shared for so long, she finally broke down, sobbing into the pillow that still smelled like Harrison, like leather and sage and the desert wind. She thought about giving up then, about following Harrison into whatever waited beyond this life. But when she closed her eyes, she could hear his voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her. "Live," he said, "live fully, for both of us. Finish the story." So she lived. She stayed at the ranch, helping Thomas and his wife manage the property, spending time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories of the old days and of the grandfather they would never forget. She planted a garden beside Harrison's grave, filling it with desert wildflowers, and she visited him every evening, sitting on a bench Thomas had built, talking to Harrison about her day as if he could hear her. And perhaps he could. Tabitha believed he was still with her, watching over her, waiting for the day when they would be reunited. That belief sustained her through the lonely nights and gave her strength to face each new day. She lived to see the First World War come and go, lived to see her great-grandchildren grow and marry and have children of their own. She lived to see the ranch grow and prosper, becoming one of the largest and most successful operations in Nevada. She lived to see the world change in ways she could never have imagined when she was young, with automobiles replacing horses and electric lights replacing lanterns. But through it all, she carried the memory of that night in the canyon, of the darkness and the fear, and of the light that had saved her. She carried the memory of Harrison's strong arms catching her, of his kind voice offering comfort, of his love transforming her life. On a warm spring evening in 1925, Tabitha Hart died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her family. She was 93 years old, and she had lived a full and remarkable life. They buried her beside Harrison on the hill overlooking the ranch, and on her headstone, they carved the words she had requested. She wandered lost through the canyon at night. The cowboy's lantern led her to his arms, together forever. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's stewardship, and eventually passed to his son, who passed it to his son in turn. Generations of hearts grew up hearing the story of how it all began, of the night their great-grandmother stumbled out of the darkness and into their great-grandfather's camp, two broken souls who found healing in each other. And on certain nights, when the moon is full and the desert air is still, ranch hands swear they can see two figures walking hand in hand along the ridge, an old cowboy and his bride, forever together in the land they loved. Some dismiss it as imagination or the play of shadows, but those who knew Harrison and Tabitha, those who heard their story and understood the depth of their love, know better. Love like theirs does not end with death. It endures, eternal and unchanging, a testament to the power of two hearts finding each other against all odds. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, hope exists. Even when we are lost and afraid, there is light waiting to guide us home. Even when all seems broken beyond repair, love can make us whole again. The story of Harrison Hart and Tabitha Kane has become legend in Nevada, passed down through generations. A tale of love born in tragedy and tempered by hardship, a love that grew stronger with each passing year until it became something immortal. It is a story that reminds us of the best of what humanity can be, of courage and kindness, of second chances and new beginnings. And it all began with a lantern hanging beside a cabin door, a simple light in the vast darkness of the desert night, and two people brave enough to reach for each other when fate brought them together. The cowboy and the lost woman finding in each other everything they had been missing, building from the ruins of their old lives something beautiful and lasting and true. That is the power of love. That is the promise of hope. That is the legacy of Harrison and Tabitha Hart, whose story will continue to inspire as long as there are people who believe that love can conquer all, that light can drive away darkness, and that sometimes, when we are most lost, we find exactly what we need. Their ranch still stands today, now a historical site that draws visitors from around the world who come to see where this legendary love story unfolded. They walk through the restored cabin, see the original lantern that Harrison hung that fateful night, now protected under glass in a place of honor. They stand on the hill where Harrison and Tabitha are buried side by side and look out over the desert that shaped them. And they leave understanding something fundamental about love, about courage, about the resilience of the human spirit. They leave knowing that no matter how dark their own nights may be, there is always hope. There is always a light somewhere in the darkness, waiting to guide them home. There is always a chance for love, for healing, for happiness, if only they are brave enough to keep walking toward it. That is the true legacy of Harrison and Tabitha Hart. Not the ranch they built or the family they raised, though both are impressive. Their true legacy is the reminder that love is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of healing the deepest wounds and lighting the darkest paths. Their legacy is hope, pure and simple, the hope that sustained them through loss and hardship and carried them to a happiness neither thought possible. She wandered lost through the canyon at night, afraid and alone, her world shattered. But the cowboy's lantern led her to his arms, and in those arms she found safety, love, and a future brighter than any she could have imagined. Together, they proved that the human heart is capable of incredible resilience, that from the ashes of tragedy can rise something beautiful, and that true love, once found, never dies. It simply changes form, becoming memory, becoming legend, becoming inspiration for all who come after. Harrison and Tabitha's love story echoes through time, a beacon of hope for the lost and the broken, a reminder that somewhere in the darkness, a light is waiting. And if we are brave enough to walk toward it, if we are open to the possibilities fate offers, we too might find our way home, might find the arms that will hold us and the heart that will love us through whatever storms may come. That is their gift to us. That is their story. And it will endure as long as there are people who believe in the power of love to transform lives and light the way home.